This morning's scripture is taken from the book of Genesis, chapter 28, verses 10 to 22. Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you, your descendants, the land on which you're lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth.
I thought about making some entrance music with Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven, but didn't know if that would be too wild for you all. So. It's been a strange week to be a pastor. It's not been hard for me to come up with a response for what has happened over this past week, and especially early last Sunday morning. But finding the right words has been a bit more challenging. A friend of mine posted that she actually threw out the first 3 sermons that she wrote this week. It's hard to find the right words, because if we surveyed the room this morning, I bet you we would find a number of different responses to the tragedy that happened. And we find those responses mostly along political lines. But when I think about what has happened, I feel sadness. With the recent events and the shootings at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando early last Sunday morning, it's easy to feel, in many ways, despondent. It's easy to be despondent about the shooting itself. Most of the 49 victims, and we've got a picture of many of them, most of them who died were very young. Basically, they were kids with their whole lives ahead of them. They were there in what was supposed to be a safe place, or what had been, until that moment, a safe place for many years for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people. We know that this was an act of hatred and an act of terror. And it's easy to be despondent about the motives of the shooter, a man who pledged allegiance to ISIS on a 911 call shortly before carrying out the attacks. But here's where the sadness for me really hits. As it turns out, the man who perpetrated the attack was probably gay himself. He was probably a person who deeply struggled with his sexuality and his identity and the message of his religion about his place in the world. And so his motivation may not have been so much about committing jihad, but may have been more of a final act of despair. It's easy to despair this morning that we can't seem to protect our citizens from violence, from mass shootings and from gun violence. The same weekend that there was this shooting, you think about Chicago, there were 40 shot in the city that day. There were people that were shot in Niagara Falls and in Buffalo. It's easy to be depressed We just seem to fracture along the same old political lines and seem to talk past each other and shout at each other as a country within hours of the event. We can't seem to solve anything. We only point fingers. There are many reasons why this has made me feel down. But here's the thing I'm most frustrated about, the thing that brings me some anger. I'm angry at the reaction from many Christians because we seem to be no different than the rest of the country. As a pastor, I feel a bit like a stranger in my own land, and I'm starting to wonder if Christianity in our country has been bankrupted by ideology and by money.
Yes.
Now, to be fair, many of my friends who are pastors wrote deeply meaningful words of support to the victims and their families. They attended the vigils. They donated money. They mourned. But the tradition I grew up in, the evangelical tradition, seems to have lost its mind, or at least its way. Many reacted with the same old shouts that this was just plain old Islamic terrorism. It was time for more war. Ban all Muslim immigrants, said Franklin Graham, one of our most popular spokespeople. Many said, just don't come for my guns. Many secretly reveled in the fact that the victims were gay, and they continued to press for laws that stripped rights and protections from LGBTI people. I saw a lot of disgusting and disheartening memes from social media this week. Things like, you reap what you sow. More than one person suggested that this was just all some kind of government conspiracy to take away the rights of Americans. Have we lost our minds? It hurts that a growing number of people's reply to Christianity and the Christian faith is this: just imagine no religion. But can we really blame them when the people that claim to be spokespeople for American Christianity, when all they offer the public is fear and paranoia and death and violence? You know, atheists claim that religious people are full of hatred and bigotry, and we know that that's not true. But regardless of whether they are Christian or Muslim, a lot of Christians seem to be intent on proving them right. It's my observation that the Christians who speak the loudest during these times, or who get the most press in these times, are the people who know the least about theology and about biblical interpretation and about church history. This internal ignorance that we seem to have as a Christian community has got to stop. To rephrase a quote from Frank Zappa, many Christians seem to treat intelligence like a disease. We've become the antithesis of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. Jesus came to give us life and love and to show us the way to heaven. And so often we as followers show people death and judgment and the door to hell. And I'm sick of it. I'm sick of feeling like a stranger in my own community, and for the faith that in my heart, soul, and mind I believe deeply and has shaped me to my core. This is not what Christ came on earth to live and to teach and to die for. If loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself, those are what? The two greatest commandments, right? According to Jesus. If those things cause you to hate people and increases your desire to live in a bunker, then you need to reevaluate. Your understanding of the Christian faith really might be an adventure in missing the point. Now, where am I going with this morning? As United Methodists, we have something better to offer, and we need to start offering it now. We need to start teaching better and more effectively. The way we teach Scripture, our theology, the practice of our sacraments, they speak to what the Christian faith is really all about. It's about love and grace and life. And our church is all about building a family, a fellowship. You and I know these things deep in our hearts. And our scripture passage this morning helps us to understand what we're all about and what God's all about. Because I want you to think about Jacob's vision. He's on the run from his brother. He's in fear for his life. His brother, according to the culture of that day, is well within his rights to hate him and pursue him and kill him. He's stolen God's promise from Esau. And Jacob has taken that promise for himself. He's dishonored God. He's dishonored his father. He's dishonored his family. He's dishonored himself. He should die. But as I said last week, the point, to this point, you could look at Jacob and say, Jacob, you're a lost cause. But God isn't done with him. I want you to take a look at the scripture with me from Genesis 28. Verses 10 and 11. Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head, and he lay down to sleep. To me, this is the ultimate picture of a man at the end of his rope. I know that's a very kind of peaceful Renaissance painting. But think about what he does here. He has nothing. He has no money for a room in a nearby town. He has no friends. It's probably known far and wide by this time what he's done to his brother and his father. He's probably really not welcome anywhere. And so he lays down in a field. He's vulnerable to bandits and to wild animals. And he picks up a rock. And that's his pillow for the night. Now, if you've ever seen the land of Bethel, it's like everywhere else in that region. It's rocks and a few scraggly trees. And in the spring, during the rainy season, it's a little prettier, but there's not much there. It's a rough place to be. It's like Jacob is laying his head on this rock, and maybe he's just kind of giving up. Maybe it's the last sleep he'll ever take. He's very vulnerable here. He may not see the morning. And then something happens that I'm sure that he didn't expect. Take a look, starting in verse 12. It says he had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth. You will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you, and I will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. It's funny, if you go back and you read Isaac's blessing to Jacob, the one that Jacob stole from his brother Esau, God actually echoes that blessing. He backs up that blessing with a similar promise. God gives Jacob a dream of a stairway to heaven. And at the very top is God promising to watch over Jacob, this broken man, to bless him and all people through him. Now, why does God do this? Because it's in God's nature. As I said last week, it's in God's nature to pursue us until we give ourselves to God and to God's purposes. And now from this point forward, if you read in the scriptures, later in Genesis and through Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, you'll read that it's not just the God of Abraham and Isaac. From this day forward, God is known as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's a poignant picture of God's reach into our lives at critical points to sustain us and to carry us through to his good purposes. Jacob deserved judgment. Jacob deserved hell. And instead, God showed him heaven. And it changed Jacob's life forever. And we can see that it did change his life forever because of what follows in the story. Take a look at verse 16. He says, when Jacob woke up from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place. And I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Now, I think maybe Jacob missed the point here. It wasn't so much the place It was the message that God was going to be with him wherever he went. But regardless, early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head, and he set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. And he called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, "If God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey that I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God. And the stone I have set up as a pillar will be God's house. And all that you give me, I will give you a tenth." Jacob has a conversion moment here, because up to this point, Jacob's understanding of God's purpose for his life has been very limited, if he has any understanding at all. But this wandering son becomes the follower of God that God intends him to be. And as we'll see in the coming weeks, Jacob is a slow learner, like all of us. Jacob isn't done playing games. He's not done messing up, and he's not done embarrassing his family. He's kind of set in that groove. And God's people are kind of set in that groove, always kind of in it for themselves, as we'll see through the unfolding of the story through Genesis 50. But even when he wanders, Jacob never forgets God. He never forgets this moment ever again. And God doesn't either. God carries out the promise to Jacob's offspring. And that brings up an important point. The journey is never finished. Jacob's journey was incomplete. And God isn't done with us either. We will always need to walk in a spirit of humility, because the journey never ends. And we never have it all figured out. But I want to go back to the lesson of the vision of heaven from God. I want to end there. I want to ask you, what kind of a vision are we offering those who are seeking God? Do we really give people a vision that's worth pursuing and finding out more about? Do people see heaven, or do they see hell when they look at the church? Or do they see anything at all? How about the words they hear? Are they life-giving, or are they death-dealing? We can be the difference. And we should, in the very least, offer an alternative vision, alternative word to the words that many of the most vocal Christians tend to say. The gospel of Jesus Christ doesn't change. It's never changed. It never will. But let's make sure we offer the world the words of Jesus instead of our own anger and our own pain. Christ came to give us life to the full. We go out in that same spirit for the same purpose. When it comes to how we deal with each other as people, it's all about grace. Grace is what establishes the pattern for our gathering and our worship and our fellowship together. Now, if God can extend his grace to Jacob and to each of us, we can extend that same grace to the rest of the world. And we should. So I ask you this week, who will you show God's love and grace to?